Roads and villages turned into rivers overnight, and tens of thousands displaced.
Our homes are submerged now, and we can only access the area by boat.
After months of drought, the heavy rains are now destroying what was left of people's crops and livestock. Malnutrition and a threat of diseases like cholera and malaria are now on the rise. Many areas in central and southern Somalia have been completely cut off, and people here are now in urgent need of aid.
We desperately need help here from anyone who can help us. Things are bad and help needs to come fast before it is too late.
Aid operations are now underway, delivering food and supplies to the most vulnerable, but many places are hard to reach. With another tropical storm heading towards East Africa, more heavy rainfall is expected in the next coming days.
All right, I'm now joined by Gemma Connell in Nairobi. She's from the United Nations and is coordinating their aid relief to the affected areas. Welcome to DW Africa, Gemma. Can you tell us about the situation on the ground as we speak in the flood-affected areas?
Sure, and thanks so much for having me today. We've got a very serious situation across multiple countries in East Africa right now. There's about 2.5 million people affected by the flooding across the region, and that includes in Ethiopia, Somalia, South Sudan, and Sudan, as well as more people in Tanzania and Uganda. So there are hundreds of thousands of people who have been displaced, who've lost their homes, who've lost their livelihoods. We've got many reports of thousands of livestock killed across these countries by the floods, both riverine flooding and flash flooding. And of course, we've got roads down and we've got access challenges to get to people in need.
Right, talking about those access challenges, how are you getting the aid into those remote parts where bridges have been swept away and roads, as you say?
So in each of the countries across the region, the humanitarians are scaling up as rapidly as they can. We're using helicopters in many countries in South Sudan and Somalia, for example. In other countries, we're using boats to try and get to people in need. And in other places, you'll see humanitarians literally walking the last mile to reach people who need assistance.
Yeah, and those efforts must be commended. But Gemma, we are talking about a situation here where we can expect, at least from what we're hearing from the forecasters, that these heavy rains will continue for the months to come, really. Just how prepared are you from an aid relief perspective for this?
It's an excellent question. So we are very worried about the forecasts. The one piece of good news is we have seen a small amount of reprieve in recent days with less rains falling, but that certainly doesn't mean that we're in the clear. We do anticipate, based on the forecast, that we will have more rains in the weeks ahead. So how are we prepared? Well, this is a real challenge because this is not the first shock to hit this region this year. We're actually coming off the back of two back-to-back failed rainy seasons. So up until a few weeks ago, we were dealing with drought response in these areas. And we're also, of course, dealing with violence and conflict in many areas across the region, with millions of people displaced and refugees in all of these countries. So this is coming as an additional burden on top of the already stretched humanitarian response across the region. So we are appealing urgently for additional funding in each of the countries affected to make sure that we can scale up the response as quickly as we can. We're running right now on the supplies that we have in country, but we're desperately trying to bring more in and to do more.
All right. That's Gemma Connell from the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. She's in Nairobi. Thank you. Now, as we mentioned, the flooding in East Africa is the result of unprecedented heavy rains that began several months ago. So what's causing the unusual rainfall? Well, it's all about different air temperatures colliding. As you see here, the air around the Horn of Africa is warmer than normal. It meets cooler than normal air coming all the way from Australia. Here, over the Indian Ocean, this clash and the movement in the circle of the warm and the cool air is what creates the very heavy rainfall that is of a magnitude not seen in years, perhaps even decades. It's a different story in southern Africa, where many parts of the region have been hit with a devastating drought. In Zimbabwe, animals have been affected the most as the lack of rain dries up water holes and grazing areas. More than 100 elephants have died in Zimbabwe's wildlife reserves since September.
A once majestic animal reduced to this. This elephant was trying to get to an area known as the Mana Pools, a waterhole for wildlife here in northern Zimbabwe. Instead, it got stuck in the drying mud and later died of exhaustion. Severe drought has turned the clay soil here into a death trap. Park officer Munyaradzi Zoro says he prays every morning for rain, but it simply doesn't come.
Since the water level on most pens is decreasing, so it might be worse with time if the rains failed.
Water sources are all but dried up here, and animals can't find enough food either. Park authorities say they've been forced to abandon their usual policy of non-intervention.
We come up with the feeding strategy now, where we are saying we need to supplement the feeding of animals right in the flood plain, because the food which used to be there, the acacia pods, they could not make it because of rain, and we are not certain when the rain is coming. So to avoid losing of animals, we are saying we need to intervene to sort of maintain population sizes.
The plight of these animals is having a knock-on effect on nearby villages. Earlier this year, Zimbabwe's government declared a national disaster after the drought damaged harvests. Now, hungry wild animals have been attacking livestock and crops in areas where food was already in dangerously short supply. Officials here say climate change is hitting Zimbabwe hard. It's altered weather patterns. Right now, there's little sign of respite.